Hello,
Hi, we're complete again.
I'm back. So, this is Freud III, the Wolfman.
Bro. And then we need to go. Yeah, great.
Who is the Wolfman? This is the Wolfman. So, a little bit of background to start with. The Wolfman refers to Sergei Pankachev, who was a Russian aristocrat who had, by all accounts, a very hard time of things. So his sister committed suicide, and his family were renowned for their depressive sensibilities. So his dad had a long history of depression, and he became depressed himself, particularly following an outbreak of gonorrhea. So very tragic family circumstances, deep sense of mental unease, prompts Sergei Pankachev, the Wolfman to arrive in Vienna in 1910, aged 24, seeking out the help of the great Dr. Freud in overcoming the neuroses that had arrived along with this bout of gonorrhea. And he is a character who never stopped haunting Freud throughout his long and remarkably productive career. What is the Wolfman? Which is to say, how do we understand this remarkable text in the history of Freud's development as a theorist? So it's first published in The History of an Infantile Neurosis from 1918. Well, actually, I've said that slightly wrong. From The History of an Infantile Neurosis. So it's a text that does not advertise itself as being complete. And you'll get that from your reading of The Wolfman as well. Freud says at the start that he has no pretensions to give a complete, all-encompassing account of this case, but it's just a snapshot of these particularly significant aspects of the Wolfman's childhood. It's a text in which Freud locates the origins of adult symptoms in childhood events, so a classic, well-known aspect of psychoanalysis. And in doing that, he gives an account of the patient's symptoms and, of course, also an account of the analytic process. How do I make this go
I
away?
think the last one.
Yes, and it's a key text in the development of Freud's theory of infantile sexuality. You'll find in The Wolfman that Freud is engaged, as he writes, with defending himself and refining and explaining the analytic process. So it's kind of a meta text as well. It's a text that is about itself, its own process of composition, and a text which explains the processes behind it as well. And some of this, it contains, I think, are quite funny phrases of Freud's as well. So an example here from page 247. Theoretical contradictions are for the most part fruitless, however. As soon as we begin to move away from the material that should be our source, we run the risk of being intoxicated by our own assertions. So if any of you have had comments in your essays today about a tentative voice or using words like may or seem rather than making an argument, take a leaf out of Dr. Freud's book. Be absolutely determined, be assertive in your writing, and of course back it up with evidence in order to give that weight. And Freud's defense of psychoanalysis is in specific relationship to two figures, Jung and Adler, two former disciples of his who are developing their own slightly different systems of psychoanalysis at the same time as well. So this quotation from Abraham and Torok's book, The Wolfman's Magic Word, which I'd recommend if you're interested in following these ideas up, shows how the cardinal tenets that constitute psychoanalysis, as Freud invented it, the unconscious, infantile sexuality, again, the Oedipus complex, are all central to what's happening in the Wolfman, what does that mean? In this moment when he's defending his view against those of others. So that is context, background. Three categories that we are going to relatively briefly enter into in order to give some ideas of how we're going to work with the Wolfman in the seminar. So memory, fantasy, species being, of course a phrase of Marx's, and religion, which is something that has haunted us throughout this module. Memory. Stuff happens, you remember it. That is the basic idea of memory, but of course it's more complicated than that. Memory is never a straightforward record of the facts. And this is central to the way in which Freud goes about piecing together the youthful experience of the Wolfman, which comes to be central to his diagnosis and to the healing work of psychoanalysis. So Gillian Beer's introduction, which is also worth a read, begins with a quotation from Anne Thackeray-Ritchie. There is often a great deal more of the past in the future than there was in the past itself at the time. So the past is not a static, straightforward well of facts that you simply enter, but it's something that is constituted in relationship to the future. And this is really important to Freud's sense of the analytic process, as in this quotation here, in which he describes the way in which memory is not just recovered, but in actual fact reconstructed. So there's a relationship between memories and truth, which is not necessarily straightforward. Freud writes, "These previously unconscious memories do not even to be true. They may be true, but their truth is often distorted and interspersed with fantasized elements in a very similar way to so-called cover memories that have been spontaneously retained. I will say only that scenes such as we find in my patient's case from such an early age with such content, which then lay claim to such extraordinary significance for the history of the case, are not as a rule reproduced as memories, but must be guessed at, reconstructed from some total of indications, step by step, and with considerable effort." So it's very difficult to get the memories, these distant childhood memories that are so important to Freudian analysis. It's in this act of recovery and exploring memories that psychoanalysis may discover its greatest intimacy to literature. So a very famous quotation from the opening of Eliot's The Wasteland, published 4 years after The Wolfman in 1922, summarises the key sense of how psychoanalysis posits memory as always inflected by and in relation to fantasy. The world at this moment, this post-First World War moment for T.S. Eliot, is described as April being the coolest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. And it's that mixture of memory and desire that's so central to Freudian analysis. A longer description of the relationship between fantasy, memory and literature is here in this article from Taekyun Kwong, which I just discovered the last few days. I think it's a really fantastic article. I'll put it on Mole. And this is an essay which triangulates Freud's From a History of an Infantile Neurosis, which contains the Wolfman, with Derrida's thought. We've mentioned him at various points, and also brings in some elements of Eastern philosophy I'm not going to touch on now. But I'll read this quotation out just to highlight this triangular relationship in psychoanalysis between memory, fantasy and literature. Freud's celebrated case study more closely resembles a literary work than it does a meticulously composed scientific record, given that it provides seemingly infinite possibilities for reinterpretation. The study not only describes the process involved in the interpretation of dreams, but it also outlines the structure of remembering through deferred acts, along with repetition and transference. Indeed, the style of the writing itself is seemingly intended to call attention to the way in which science and literature are dynamically synthesized, and the manner in which the mode of remembering functions in the study's dialectic. As Jacques Derrida observes, the theory of psychoanalysis then becomes a theory of the archive and not only a theory of memory. Significantly, in Freud's case study of the so-called Wolfman, memory, more accurately remembering or recollection, serves as the key element, given its role as the kernel of Freudian repression. Perhaps the numerous rereading of this single empirical scientific study are due to its treatment of memory, which is, after all, the most mysterious structure of the human mind. So memory here in this quotation is emphasized as a dynamic process, something that you have to do rather than a well of meaning that you access, remembering, recollecting. So there's a sense of agency there. And through all of this, clearly we're involved in imaginative, creative acts as well as the scientific world that Freud aims to be offering the world. To think more about how The Wolfman works as a literary text, just a few hints as to how it plays into different genres. So the case history, of course, is its own distinct genre. You may think of it as in part a horror story. Certainly it's a story in which horrifying things happen. You might even be so bold as to think of it as a Gothic novella. Certainly it deals with fairy stories. There are specific references to that textual form in the text. One of the things I think that's most interesting for me is the way that Freud himself functions as a character in this narrative, as a kind of psychic detective. Think about the way that Freud reveals information, and particular sentences that offer verbal echoes of detective fiction, ideas of suspicion, guilt, and processes of deduction that he's involved with. Last slide specifically on the topic of memory. So memory, fantasy, and literature emphasises the way in which this is an imaginative process, but memory, fantasy, and biology indicates something perhaps slightly more peculiar, the claim that appears at the end of the Wolfman, or the hypothesis rather than the claim, that there may be aspects of memory that are hereditary rather than individual. So this is a way in which, perhaps in an echo of Darwin, Freud's ideas of memory are engaged with questions of biology. We've touched before already on how Freud utilises biology in his work. So at the end, Freud says, "This concludes what I wish to say about this case. Only two of the numerous problems to which it gives rise seem to me to deserve particular emphasis. The first concerns those phylogenetically transmitted patterns that, like philosophical categories, enable us to accommodate our impressions of life. I should like to suggest that they are the precipitates of human cultural history. The Oedipus complex, the complete account of the child's relationship to his parents, is one example, indeed the best known. When experiences cannot be fitted into this hereditary schema, they are reworked in the imagination. We are often in a position to note how the schema takes precedence over individual experience." So phylogenetic transmission, here on the fourth line of this quotation, indicates ideas that are transmitted through species. So phylogeny is being understood in relation to species. So it's species being that phrase of Marx's again. So the hereditary schema is to do with something that may be common or deeply woven into the fabric of humanity, and which may take precedence over individual experience. So whatever happens to you as an individual organism, there are elements imprinted in your DNA, as we might now say, that are involved with Freud's philosophy, the hereditary schema, as he calls it. This invites us to think about humans as animals again, which is something we've touched on many times. And the idea of the animal, particular images of animals, are really central to Freud's writing. We talked a couple of weeks ago about whether we might think of the id as being inhuman. In the interpretation of dreams, one of Freud's earlier breakthrough texts, he begins with a question: what do geese dream of? We'll answer that in the seminar. So the way in which ideas of dream work are framed by Freud with this analogy about an animal. And his psychological blow to human exceptionalism, as he described it, comes in the footprints of Darwin's biological blow. So Freud hypothesizes three blows to human exceptionalism. Cosmology, so the Earth goes around the sun rather than the other way around, associated with the Polish astronomer Copernicus. Biology, Darwin messes with the idea of the perfect, unique, divine human form, and Freud, of course, messes with the idea of the human mind as this miraculous non-animal entity. And another quotation from this passage on memory that reveals more explicitly the way in which this hereditary schema forges a relationship between the human and the animal. If we consider the way in which the 4-year-old responds to the reactivated primal scene, indeed, we have only to think of the far simpler reactions of the 18-month-old child to the original experience. It is difficult to discuss the notion that some kind of knowledge that resists definition, a sort of preparation for understanding, is at work in the child. What this might consist in defies the imagination. The only analogy available to us is the excellent analogy with the largely instinctive knowledge found in animals. So the hereditary schema that resists definition for Freud and defies the imagination may exist in the way that instinct exists in animals. So the way in planet Earth, the very small lizardy creatures know instinctively how to escape the snakes. There are elements of psychology hardwired into human being. Pause. So Wolfman clearly is a story about animals, about animality, and central to it is this extraordinarily unusual and beautiful depiction of wolves in a tree. Maybe we should talk about what this means in the workshop.
I think we should.
We'll just leave it there for a few seconds. Let it haunt you, as Freud is haunted by animals. A few thoughts more specifically about the different roles that animals play in Dr. Freud's bestiary. So the Wolfman refers to all kinds of different species. And here's a really kind of broad brushstroke set of assumptions about how we might read these animals. So clearly they're symbols. The wolves stand in for other meanings, which is to say they're symptoms of an underlying psychic condition. So they express the malady that Sergei's gone to Freud to help with. You could think of it another way as they're characters in the narrative. So to take a more literary approach, that the wolves are characters in the way that the wolf is a character in fairy tales. In terms of the symptoms of the Wolfman, there's a kind of reciprocal relationship. They're both objects of terror and objects of violence. So Sergei is both tormented by animals but torments them in return, which leads us to a question about the relationship between reality and the imaginary in relation to animals. Clearly these are symbolic animals, emanations of his unconscious, but also that symbolic work the animals do has something to do with animals in real life. So the way in which he torments beetles and wants to beat horses. So again, to go back to the idea of kind of memory and fantasy, the real and the imaginary, that's also deeply involved in the question of animal meaning in Dr. Freud's bestiary.
So I'm just going to talk about this one slide, a quotation by Gilles Deleuze from one of his incredible books called A Thousand Plateaus, which he co-wrote with Félix Guattari. The two of us wrote Anti-Oedipus, which is another book that they collaborated on together. Since each of us was several, there was already quite a crowd. What Deleuze and Guattari are doing is that they're interested in refusing the project of psychoanalysis as a conservative process of accommodating the subject to the world. They're interested in exploring the possibilities of different thinking articulated through a sort of quite tricky language and sort of hallucination, I guess, of schizophrenia or schizoanalysis as a way to oppose the reification of the subject and the sort of formulation of the subject, as always, sort of referring back to a stable center, and that stable center, as they see it, is the Oedipal complex. They refuse General Freud, as they call him, on page 19 of A Thousand Plateaus. Psychoanalysis, in psychoanalysis, they say there is always a general, always a leader, and then in brackets, General Freud. They're kind of saying that without the solution, without a general, is to be founded in an A-centered multiplicity. And in one of their chapters of A Thousand Plateaus, they engage with Freud's Wolfman. It's very interesting, actually. It's called 1914, One or Several Wolves, and it's quite short if you wanted to dip in and out of this otherwise massive book. So this is them then. The wolf as the instantaneous apprehension of a multiplicity in a given region is not a representative, a substitute, but an I feel. I feel myself becoming a wolf, one wolf among others on the edge of the pack. A cry of anguish, the only one Freud hears. Help me not to become a wolf, or the opposite, help me not fail in this becoming. It is not a question of representation. Don't think for a minute that it has to do with believing oneself a wolf, representing oneself as a wolf. The wolf. Wolves are intensities, speeds, temperatures, non-decomposable variable distances. A swarming, a wolfing. extraordinary quote, I think, in which so they're saying, well, the only cry that Freud hears is a cry of anguish, but considering that John, I nearly called you Freud there.
Well, there you go.
But John gave us some indication of the history of the Wolfman, is actually also true, though, that it is a cry of anguish. But they're kind of saying, okay, well, what else can you hear? And in that, what we might hear is the kind of refusal to become a sort of molar identity. What Deleuze and Guattard called as molar identity is the sort of image of the father. So you're refusing patriarchy, you're refusing capitalism, all that, and instead, what you might want to think about is that the subject is, or that the subject is a sort of multiplicity, that it's an intensity, it operates at various speeds and temperatures, that we are swarms, that we are a multiplicity or a pack of wolves.
Which leads us to some final reflections on the role of religion. So under the topic of refusing the father. So this is one of several texts in which Freud engages with the idea of religion. Of course, the occasion for thinking about this is the religious mania that Sergei is subject to. His birthday is Christmas Day. That seems to open a whole can of worms for him. So I'm just going to read a few quotations that indicate some of the ways in which Freud is able to include religion in his analysis of Sergei. Those first brooding thoughts circling around the person of Christ already contained the question as to whether this sublime son could also fulfill the sexual relationship to his father that the patient had retained in his unconscious. So that relationship between religion and the unconscious is expounded also earlier. Piety becomes the dominant power of the child's life. These efforts of will are not achieved without a struggle, however. Its signs are the appearance of blasphemous thoughts and its consequence the onset of a compulsive religious ritual. So compulsive religious ritual is Freud's diagnosis of what is happening with the Wolfman. You might extrapolate that out, as Freud does elsewhere, to broader conclusions about religion as an expression of pathology. So this earlier essay, Obsessive Actions and Religious Practices. I'm certainly not the first person to have been struck by the resemblance between what are called obsessive actions in sufferers of nervous affections and the observances by means of which believers give expression to their piety. The term ceremonial, which has been applied to some of these obsessive actions, is evidence of this. Workshop tasks, really just one, just to encourage you to think about how memory and fantasy are deployed in Freud's writing here. How does he use them? What is the relationship between them? And if you could choose some examples from the text that are going to help us think that through. And that is that.
All right, see you next week.
See you next week.